I'll take it from the top. Not much to say besides welcome to Real Change's drug policy panel, and thanks to all of our panelists for being here. Quick ask, we are a small struggling nonprofit, and we are in the middle of our spring fund drive. We've got about 100,000 left to go. So if anyone feels inclined to help out, our website is realchangenews.org. There's a link at the top, and we would love it. Jumping into the panel, we are here because we are at a contentious moment for drug policy in Washington State. Things are a little more settled at the state level. Things are very much in flux here in Seattle. And while it maybe seems like we've got a direction that we're going post-Blake decision, things could also go a very different direction. So we're here to talk about what these pieces of legislation mean for the citizens of Washington State, what kind of approach they embody, and what kind of other approaches we could maybe take, imagining some alternative futures. So we've got some of the best and brightest in the state here, and I'll just do a quick introduction for everyone. I don't think I can cover everything that you all do. It is so wonderful. So add anything you want to add when we get going. Start with Alison Holcolmb. Brought you legal weed. So if you like legal weed, you can thank Alison. She's worked on drug policy with the ACLU forever as the director of their Smart Justice Initiative nationally. And she's back here in Washington as the ACLU Washington's political director, with a big feather under her cap, or in her cap, with cannabis. She's looking to push better drug policy further along for all drugs. Which is great. And Representative Nicole Macri represents all of us here in Seattle. Thank you. And also is the deputy director of the Downtown Emergency Services Center. So has a ton of up close and personal experience with this topic and some of the other topics that intersect with drug policy, like homelessness and mental health and so on. And is herself an advocate and has worked on a lot of legislation to improve those areas. I'm having the pleasure of meeting Deaunte for the first time today, but big resume. First LGBTQIA chair of the NAACP. Been an organizer with Vocal New York, Vocal Washington, doing harm reduction, which is obviously like right in the middle of this topic. Like, it's become such a popular phrase that even I would say the conservative leaning people are now using it. And he's also done just a ton of work on other stuff, HIV advocacy. I think I'm getting this right, but you're currently doing programming for Converge Media. And yeah, the list goes on. In the interest of time, fill in any that I missed that you think are really important to the topic. Lastly, here with me is James on the split screen right here. James and I are friends from way back through skateboarding and just life. And we recently reconnected. James had, I don't know, do you want to kind of talk about it a little bit? Like just some issues, experience with mental health in the criminal justice system that gave him a really firsthand perspective on the stuff we're talking about today. Is that?
Well, you just explained it right there. That's
cool.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, anything you all want to add before we get started? Great. The format I'm thinking of is, I kind of have a panelist in mind for each question, but I really want everybody to hop in and discuss and riff off of each other. If you have an idea or an insight on someone's answer, throw up your hand and I'll make sure to get to you, or just take yourself off mute and wait for a normal conversational break. With that said, let's jump in. So the first thing I want to ask, and I'll kind of direct this towards Alison, is so we have, now a state level criminalization bill. We are pretty much guaranteed to have a bill that criminalizes public use and possession at the city level. So the landscape has changed in that drug possession is no longer a felony, but now we've added public use to the kind of milieu of things that can be criminalized. What kind of impact will we see on people? Like what will the consequences be for everyday users and for people.
Thanks so much, Tobias, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm really excited to hear from my fellow panelists, all who have brilliant experience with these issues. What I expect to see, well, let me put it in context first. As folks may know, the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, part of our Department of Health and Human Services, every year conducts an annual national survey on drug use and health. And the most recently available data that we have from 2021 indicates that hundreds of thousands of Washingtonians used illicit drugs other than cannabis that year alone. Hundreds of thousands. We are not going to see hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands of arrests. For most people who can afford to use their drugs in privacy, we are not going to see much change at all in their experience. What we are going to see is that our most vulnerable members of our communities, who are disproportionately people of color, people who are LGBTQIA+, people who have mental health issues, and who cannot afford to use their drugs in privacy, will be subjected to greater risk of arrest, being booked into jail, being strip searched, being locked in a cage, and having the physical and mental traumas associated with that experience on top of the legal and economic consequences that flow from even having a criminal charge filed against you. It's not even important that you have a conviction. So that's unfortunately what I expect us to see.
Yeah. Anything to add, anyone? On that particular question?
No, I think that's right on.
That was-
Unfortunately.
I mean, you weren't criminalized for drugs, but
No.
having a record has impacted.
Yeah, definitely having a record has impacted, like, you know, being able to get housing and my daily life. But, you know, coming from, and I was locked up for like 18 months this past from 2021 to 2022. But being inside, like, I came across a lot of people that were impacted by drug violations, and yeah, just seeing people come in for possession and, you know, whatnot. It's almost like you've seen people criminalized for just being sick, almost, you know, like just getting caught with doing your drug, you know.
Yeah, and you were saying a lot of those people end up cycling through over and over again.
Yeah,
You see people coming back.
yeah. I was there for 18 months. I saw numerous people that were in and out just for, you know, a lot of times it was other things too. It's like, you know, like mostly theft that coincides with that, and then getting caught with possession was also, but, you know, streaming them through like drug courts and that whole process. I mean, I don't see like a major success rate, and I haven't seen, from my eyes, I haven't seen a major success rate in it. You know, it's just a cycle going back and forth. You know, people aren't going to be able to get off their drugs and the addiction until they're ready.
Yeah,
You know, but
maybe prison isn't the best environment to
prison
do
is not
that.
the best environment for drugs.
So this one's more purely about that state legislative process, and it is, as you maybe guessed, for you, Representative Macri. You joined a group of progressive legislators in opposing the state level criminalization bill 2 times during the regular and the special session. And I was just curious to hear kind of your reasoning and, you know, what motivated your vote and what kind of the discussions were all around it on both sides.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for that, Tobias, and thanks for having me this evening. It's great to be with this group of very well informed and experienced folks. So I had the opportunity to actually vote against different versions of this bill 3 times this past session. First, when it came to the House floor, and it was a far less punitive, but still a bill that recriminalized drug possession and added for the first time this public use charge and penalty. And then at the last day of session, and then when we had the revised bill during the special session, and my position on this issue has been consistent for many years. In fact, I was one of a small number Democrats who voted against the original Blake legislation, and back in 2021, the so-called Blake fix legislation back in 2021 at the end of the session, when the Supreme Court came down with the Blake decision during our legislative session in 2021. And my reason for that, for voting against these bills, really comes from my personal and professional experience, knowing and working with and working to support drug users for many years, working to support people who use drugs in getting stable housing, getting appropriate care for substance use disorder, getting appropriate care for trauma and psychiatric conditions, and just like having a deep understanding of what works and what doesn't, both just from the personal experience, but also from studying what has what interventions work best on a broad scale. And being, I think, a strong harm reductionist voice within the Washington State Legislature based on all of that experience. I've come to know that we really don't need to hurt people to help them. And I've learned from lots of folks, including members of Vocal and folks from Washington Recovery Alliance, and from the folks who I've worked with directly at DESC, that that jail never really helps anyone. And there is this sort of common knowledge, like this conventional wisdom, that jail provides an opportunity for people to get clean, and that there are these folks out there who believe that who will say that jail has helped them. But when I've talked to people, I've not had anyone tell me, I believe my experience in jail helped me. They may say, I believe my experience getting clean for some period of time was helpful. I could have done that, and it would have been far more humane if I was able to do that, not when I was incarcerated. And so I think based on those experiences and all that we know, not just about what Alison said about the disparate impact, the discrimination in who gets picked up on these charges, who gets convicted, but also on terms of what we know. Sorry, I'm getting some weird messages on my computer that wants a reboot. That distracted me. But also what we know about the harm that incarcerating people can have, the real risk of death that increases when we incarcerate people, particularly people with opioid use disorder. To me, I just could not reconcile a criminal legal overlay on a health condition, because that's essentially what we're doing. If we lived in a functional society where we can say, okay, we're all going to agree that it's not preferable for people to use drugs in public, that it is more preferable for people to use drugs in private, and we had enough of a social contract where people could have safe, stable housing, could be safe from abuse, and we could say it's very reasonable for us as a society to say that people who use drugs can use drugs in private. I may have different feelings about these policies, but given the epidemic of homelessness, the racial bias that is very well documented in terms of our criminal legal system, there was just no way that I could bring myself to support the policies that we were considering. And I spent the last many years trying to sort of highlight some of these challenges.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I applaud you for voting consistently over all the years. Man, that brings up, okay, so many topics. One that I really want to ask Deaunte about, but I want to just real quickly ask you about kind of the way that you saw people's drug use change in jail, because something James told me that I think we all kind of know, but don't think about, is that drugs are just as prevalent and just as commonly used inside jails as outside. The idea that you're getting people away from them isn't true, but there are some, people maybe use more unsafely, or
Well, what happens with the person that's addicted to opiates when they enter jail, they get put on Suboxone. So they get separated from like the general population usually. Like in King County, for instance, there's the 7th floor, it's a psych floor, it's psych and medical. So if you're addicted to opiates and you're on Suboxone, they usually filter them into that pod. But then within that, you build a whole nother drug system that goes within that, where you get people selling their Suboxone to other people that, that didn't come in with the opioid addiction, but obviously have one. So you build kind of like a sub economy within that, But what happened, most of the people that I've come in contact with that are in the Suboxone program, once they get out of jail, they're not sticking to it, they go right back to using what they were using before, and not, sadly, it's opiate problem,
And you kind of mentioned sometimes that when people do sneak in the genuine article, like real stuff, maybe fentanyl or something else, they tend to use more extremely, like they party, you said, is that?
No, I mean, when I was inside, fentanyl was just kind of getting real big in Seattle, and most of the ODs that happened were from fentanyl. People were smuggling it in, and I guess people just, they're used to doing the amount they were doing on the outside, like, their tolerance levels change, especially when you're not doing it for a while, and then they take the amount that they thought they could take, and then they go down.
I feel like that's a really good segue into what I want to ask Deaunte about, which is harm reduction. And I feel like the word's going to start getting muddied here the more that different politicians use it. But as I understand it, the core principle of harm reduction is trying to keep users safe while they're using, rather than necessarily asking them to stop using to be safe. I just kind of wanted you to touch on the provisions in these various bills that, I wouldn't say mandate treatment, but strongly.
Well, that's kind of what it is, right? That's where they're saying, well, we have to hold them accountable. But for me, it was extremely going through this process over the past 2 years, and loved everyone from the politicians that even voted yes. There's still love there with them too as well. But it was really traumatizing to listen to them use that type of play on words, when really it was like war on drugs tactics, we're scaling back. And it's like, I think that, us within a state, with some of our lead-based systems and R&P programs that we did have, that already kind of gave with like referral spaces for people that have some simple possession, I think that we were making great strides. I think that instantly when I thought about that, I thought about some of my community folks that don't get that access to care, that because of the color of their skin or their orientation will not get that access. I just always just kind of find it more harmful, not just for us out here in King County, but even for our people of color that are out there in those smaller rural counties like El Whatcom, in that space where that once they get caught with even with a pipe that they can be going down for even longer than expected. Sorry, I'm in this car, but either way, it just kind of for me, it just seems like we're just scaling backwards. And I felt like a lot of the politicians, although they say that we fought as hard as we could, voting no and pushing for no. I didn't see very many people going out into their counties trying to have conversations with people with lived experience. They were having conversations with homeowners that don't understand the fentanyl overdoses that we're having in community, that has never used Narcan, that doesn't have a conversation about safe supply in their counties. I don't think that community was educated. I think that they use fear tactics. I think that they spent more time recording people while they're in crisis to scare people into this specific bill rather than actually going out there and giving people the equitable treatment and care going into some of the jails and prisons, which are already especially the jails that are already overcrowded with community members in crisis. They would have found their answers then. But I think what they chose to do was to be performative and go back to what they know because it's safer. But then again, if you do arrest people, then again, when you do have this accountability, you're putting them in jails and or in prisons that are already overcrowded, especially out here in King County. So then what do we do? So it's, for me, it's just really scary. I have a couple of friends right now that just now got out of treatment, and we are all approaching our year in recovery now. But had us been around this time in July, had us be in the same spot in July, God knows where we'd be. And I'm very thankful for y'all for even having the conversation, because still to this day, even right now, people are still afraid to have conversations about access to care. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that access to care thing is really interesting. We were just upstairs talking to one of our vendors who'd been through a community court treatment program and gotten clean. I think he said maybe a decade ago or more, during kind of when crack was more of the issue. And he was saying he came to oppose criminalization because he saw all of his Black friends not get access to the same program that helped him and get sent straight to jail. And it seems like we're reproducing that same inequity with these new laws. So,
yeah, and it's scary, because really, when you look at it and think about some of the recommendations of, like, okay, you're going to send community members to treatment, which is great, but which treatment facilities? What would that look like for our community folks? Because I can tell you, I had some community folks that were in Lakeside, Milam, and all these other different entities that are great programs, but zero Black people, zero community members from the LGBTQIA community, zero community, no access to care for our Indigenous community members, who we don't have a call to action for. Majority of them are getting locked up or incarcerated, and we're not going into the tribal spaces to even help to figure out how we could be able to better navigate it for a state as a whole. I don't think that we're thinking, I think some of the politicians are thinking with their privilege and needing their vote in mind rather than their humility, and it's hurtful.
Hand waving around the treatment, like, oh, we'll send everyone to treatment. What treatment, guys?
Yeah, who's gonna get it?
Yeah, and who's gonna get that? Cool. I wanted to pop over to James real quick and see if you would talk about kind of how jail increased your involvement with drugs, or not increase, but you know what I mean, like how getting out of jail with no support kind of maybe puts you into more contact with drugs in the drug economy.
Getting
as far as like getting released and not having a place to live and not having a job.
Well, getting released and not having support was definitely an issue that I had to deal with. I didn't have a place to stay, so my result, actually, luckily, I did have a outreach person that I had been in contact with from before I got locked up. So I reached out to them, but I was initially I had to pitch a tent for a couple months before I was able to go through that whole process to find housing. But coming out and not having work and my probation situation and stuff like that, I actually didn't really I didn't really, as far as delving back into the drug economy post getting out, it wasn't not so much, but before I got locked up, a little different. But
okay, well, maybe that's a way to a different question I had for you, which is when you were more involved in kind of the drug economy. We hear a lot about safety and public safety questions around drugs, with the implication being that they kind of make the average everyday person unsafe. And I was going to ask you, like, who is actually the most at risk when they're involved with the drug economy? Users, dealers?
Okay, but from my personal view, I mean, when you think about this, the hierarchy of the whole drug trade, drug dealers and suppliers have to worry about federal entities, the cops, DEA, narcotics, etc. And then they have to worry about each other and other groups trying to rob them. And then you have customers who, or then you have to, as a drug dealer supplier, have to worry about customers, people that interact with that have, have the risk of robbing them as well. And you have the customers who have to make money to buy their drug. So that in turn, either if they're stealing or, I don't know, they could be working a regular 9 to 5, doing it legitly, but I mean, from what we've seen in the streets, a lot of them resort to theft, and
well, I think that instead of saying that, right, we can say that they resort to survival. And I think that one of the things about it as constituents or people that are representatives and city council representatives in the state, what will they do to assist the people that are in need of survival, that need to survive? They need to find the tools. We are all coming out of the pandemic, out of isolation, in need of care. And I think that some of our community folks have just drove down the street and think that is the answer to that locking what they see up because they don't want to see it is the solution. And that is the scariest. That is the scariest part about the Western Washington that I was born and raised in. And I know that it's not, that I know that we can do better than this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reframing it that way.
Yeah.
Because I think, it is a framing question where people frame this public safety stuff as like not being caused by poverty when
it's like, well, we can go into like the narratives of what people do in their areas of survival, but it's just more so of the community leaders that are in this space need to take a step back. Not a step back in policy, because they already did that enough this time around, but more so of a step forward of leaning into our community folks. And that's really more so bootstraps to the ground. You don't need the data. You need to go in there and see. You need to go see what co-lead is out there doing. You need to see what the RMP community people are doing. You need to see what some of the KCRHA navigators are doing. Even with our youth, with community passageways and different youth care, those different spaces, go talk to them. Don't ask their EDs. Go to the people, because those are the people that need the real answers. And although they're not in the spaces to vote, but you could be able to they can vote, but how do they know that they're going to be seen and heard if you're just going off of what someone driving down in Ballard is saying, as opposed to talking to them to their face?
Yeah, get out of the car, walk around.
Get out of the car and walk around, pretty much.
This is good. Now we're on the topic of misconceptions, so I want to go back to Alison and talk about the claim that we recently heard here from a certain city attorney that we legalized drugs for a short period of time. You've pointed out on Twitter and other places that we never legalized drugs. You could always be arrested for drug possession at any time during this whole process. It just maybe was a question of who would charge you for it. Can you touch on that kind of false narrative and maybe a little bit about why people would promote that false narrative?
Sure. Well, I'll answer the why part first, because I think that's the easiest. It's to score political points, right? It's a great soundbite to say, oh, there goes crazy, chaotic Seattle legalizing drugs and driving the rest of the country to hell in a handbasket, as it were. In reality, you're absolutely right, Tobias. It's never been legalized, and we could split hairs over what the term legalize means and get into regulation, et cetera. But the bottom line is you've got various sets of laws that govern behavior. Not even cannabis is legalized under federal law, right? It's still prohibited substance, still on Schedule I, for Pete's sake, at the federal level. And then, of course, you've got Washington state law, and then you've got local laws and local jurisdictions with ordinances, which they can't conflict with state law on this. And what I was driving at in my Twitter account, I think, was maybe not so much about the federal law, because there is the practicality of how many DEA agents are there to go around and arrest all the people that are using drugs. but more about the fact that drugs themselves, setting aside the person who is in possession of them, drugs themselves are legally contraband, meaning they're illicit substances that nobody has a legal right to possess, right? Except for prescription drugs, obviously. So what we have a state law and have had the state law in the book since 1981, that is our Forfeiture Act. And that Forfeiture Act is what law enforcement uses to go after homes and cars and cash and all of that. But it also seizes and forfeits the drugs that are found. And so the statute itself defines drugs as contraband, says that they're subject to seizure, and that can happen anytime, and you don't even have to bring a criminal charge. Officer can seize the drugs and they can be disposed of. That's always been the case. So whether you want to arrest the person or not, they're not entitled to keep their drugs. And moreover, there are a number of laws on our books. There's not a politician except for Representative Macri and a few of her friends who doesn't love to pass a new criminal law. So we have hundreds of criminal laws that cover just about every behavior that we could find potentially obnoxious. And ACLU has a good time challenging some of them on constitutional basis. But for example, the city of Seattle, where we see frequently over and over again, there's drug trade happening in our bus stops. People are smoking fentanyl on our buses. Well, it just so happens there are already misdemeanors on the books, on Seattle's books, that say it's a crime to be smoking fentanyl. It's not specifically smoking fentanyl, but smoking, vaping, doing anything obnoxious that is contrary to community standards on a bus or at a bus stop. So if the city attorney wants to start arresting and charging people for that behavior, she's welcome to. I wouldn't invite her to, but she's been able to do that since long before we even started talking about the Blake decision. So these laws are already available. If law enforcement really is what people think is the right policy answer, and I think you're hearing a lot of good arguments about why it's not, and it's actually counterproductive to solving the real problem of people dying from a really dangerous drug supply.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, just want to throw this out there. If some people had equitable housing, maybe they wouldn't be smoking outside. And then that just goes there much love to the county that I live in, but everyone said, oh, well, we got these really big, and sounds like a Republican that I know. We have these really big ideas with housing, and we have these great plans, and they're going to come through. But wait a minute, I don't like what I see outside, but the housing stuff, we're really working on it. But at the end of the day, like, no one's really striving. When you're looking at housing, you have to look at the intersections and the impacts of the people that have been out there that need the housing. And that's our community members that some may use substances. And I wish that we can honestly figure out exactly what that equitable housing looks like, and circle back on some of these people's plans when it comes to giving community members that access. Sorry, you didn't ask me, but
enough of it. When you jump in, that's great. Please keep jumping in. Yeah, it starts with enough housing and not criminalizing people for using outside before the housing exists.
Right, because I'm quite sure I wouldn't have been smoking meth outside if I was properly housed.
Yeah, no one wants to do that. And that kind of touches on my next question, which was going to be for Representative Macri, about just visibility and kind of like, the I would say the hot spots for home crime, all of the things that you're seeing people complain about on Nextdoor, complain about online. Why are people, many of them who don't live necessarily in those areas, so obsessed with these areas? Does visibility play into? I think we maybe covered a little bit of it, but take it away.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that is a great question. I mean, I think there is a little bit about sort of the mythology and building a narrative around the visibility. And so some of these locations become somewhat iconic. Downtown Seattle as a symbol of what it means for the region. And so downtown Seattle is a place that many people in the region have been to. So many people may not have been to every little downtown in every town in King County, but many people have come to ball games or social events, or whatever, or just tourist activities in downtown Seattle. So everyone feels like they have a connection to downtown Seattle and they can picture it, and they feel some, many people feel some connection to it. And a lot of what we are hearing kind of in the public narrative is a little bit of nostalgia about, like, I used to be able to walk in downtown Seattle, and we used to not have these challenges. Well, I've been around for a long time, working and living in the downtown Seattle area, and I've seen these trends, like in the mid 90s through the mid 2000s, when there was a pretty healthy crack cocaine market in downtown Seattle, and we heard those sort of nostalgic refrains back then, like back many years ago, we would not see all these people, smoking crack in doorways and blah, blah, blah. And then when we saw kind of the methamphetamines be sort of the what kind of flood the illicit market, then we heard nostalgia about the days before methamphetamine. And then of course, I think right before the pandemic, we saw the illicit market really flooded with injectable heroin. And so the big concern was around seeing all those orange caps and needles, and the health concern about needles. So I think there is this, I call it the kind of reefer madness dynamic. It goes, all the way back to the 1930s when cannabis was demonized, and this idea that specific kinds of drugs could make a person literally insane, and we've seen that happen again and again. So fentanyl is the kind of villain du jour, and there certainly are aspects related to fentanyl use that are unique and uniquely dangerous for users, and we should be concerned about that, just like we have been concerned about the unique risks of using injectable drugs and the health harms that can have. The risk of overdose with fentanyl is objectively much greater than other kinds of drugs. But I think the kind of the visibility of it is something that is easy for people to sort of use to point to. And I think more and more we've seen, videos on social media or in the mainstream media that really work to dehumanize people who use drugs and exploit them, particularly people who are must use outdoors. And I want to kind of go back to the point that Deaunte said earlier about the role of having stable housing and just having safety in your life in two ways. One is, as Alison said, hundreds of thousands of people use illicit drugs in this state and in every single state in the United States around the world. Humans have always been seeking out some kind of mind-altering experience, always since the beginning of time. And always since the beginning of time, there's been some effort to try to regulate and control that activity. But there's two things. I know this from my longtime work with people who use drugs, who have long experiences of being unhoused, is that housing can often provide the stability that causes people to reduce their use, to use in less harmful ways, and in some or many instances to stop using substance altogether. So there is this helpful effect of just having stability. I think we understand more about substance use now than we have in the past. And for people, lots of people use substances. Most people use substances without a problem. But for some people, particularly those who are going to be at higher risk for getting arrested, here's the thing: like if you're stably housed and using drugs casually, the likelihood that you're going to have interaction with law enforcement is very low. But if you are deep in addiction, you're unhoused, your risk of being arrested goes way up. And so providing those social supports for folks, access to housing, access to care, is so essential. And I think it's really important that we're talking about this sort of visibility issue, because I think for many people, it's also an expression of the frustration that people have about the fact that we as a society haven't fully and adequately addressed the challenges of the housing crisis, the number of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our community. And I think downtown Seattle is a place that everyone can sort of picture and see that. But I think it also helps us to see that this is a problem that we can address, because there are some known areas where public drug use is more prevalent and apparent. And some of the interventions Deaunte actually mentioned, like co-lead and the Regional Homelessness Authority outreach strategy in downtown, are really having great positive impacts. But instead of focusing our policy attention and our investment, although there is some focus of investment to scale up these interventions, we've spent a lot of time talking about what does accountability look like? How do we penalize people? And how and this sort of misbelief that these sort of negative motivators are going to change behavior. When there's really no evidence at all that shows that those sorts of interventions help people to get well or to gain stability.
And I love that you said that, because, you know, one of the things that's been so hurtful to me to watch is, like, I've watched very many politicians who are in recovery themselves speak about accountability. But when you were going through your space, right, it took you to get yourself out of there. It took you to have that access to community. No matter who we are, we need that access, whether you're sober, whether you're in the areas of usage. But speaking to my community members who use substances, we just need that access. And if people had the privileges, again, I say privileges, that some of the people in leadership have had, our community folks would be on a road to recovery. And recovery does not mean abstinence. Recovery is being able to find your equitable care of community folks, of your of access to basic needs in our community. And I think that people just shy away from it. We love putting ourselves we love looking at people in the other box, but we are all in the other box. And it's just really interesting that the majority of the people that I heard speaking so much about how great this bill was in the state are people that were once being looked at as the other.
But maybe they had an easy time, but not everybody has an easy time.
Right. And I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. You know, this bill is going to affect Black and brown folks. This is going to affect queer folks. This is going to affect Indigenous folks far more other than anyone else in the space. And that's not to take away from anyone else, but it is going to impact people of color tremendously. And I'm afraid of what is going to happen. And I think it's really just going to take all of you on the line. Real change. Thank you for even giving this access. This is not me calling anyone out. This is an opportunity for us to really spend this year calling people in, writing your city council representatives and your mayors and saying, hey, let me talk to you about harm reduction and safe supply, because you need to know about it.
No, Representative Macri talked a lot about kind of what we've done for forever about drugs and how it hasn't worked in a lot of ways. And so I want to kind of make our last question focused on safe supply and maybe decriminalization and some of what I would say we all see as positive alternatives to what we're doing now. And I want to start, Deaunte, I know you're just talking, but can you talk about safe supply, what it means, safe consumption sites, how that stuff can help?
Well, I think that at the end of the day, like, I think that, one of the conversations that I think Alison had brought up was like when we were talking about needle exchanges in our community, and how we were doing syringe exchanges, and they were a lot. And shout out to the 43rd, because y'all have a lot of y'all were like the matriarchs of like helping some of the representatives and the people out there in the district really help push the conversation. But we just don't need it in that area. We need it in that area. But at the same time, when you look at areas like SeaTech, Tukwila, Federal Way, South King County, right, where people have been gentrified to, where there aren't as many nonprofit resources out there, they don't get access to. We do need access for them to be able to get safe supply options out there. Because when I was out working for a nonprofit entity, there were people were impacted by more health disparities out in South King County through injection use. And we still need to be providing our community members access to that safe supply, access to supplies such as that. I was just looking out there in Canada. There's a movie called Love in the Time of Fentanyl. Y'all should watch it. It's an amazing documentary where they had a safe supply space, where people were able to get safe supply in the space, and there were no deaths in that space. And I just think that all it takes is just to try. People think that it's dangerous, but we're giving community access, and guess what? They wouldn't be using on a bus.
Yeah, 100%. And
they might get a house. I don't know. I just think that it's just, I don't know. That's just where I'm at with that. Alison, I talk too much. Go ahead.
Live. Yeah, I think that's got to be part of the conversation, is safe supply. So yeah, and maybe Alison, before you go, we're running a little tight on time, so I'm going to throw it to the lightning round. And the next question is 2 to 3 sentences. You get a magic wand to change one thing about our state's drug policy. What is it?
Well, it's perfect segue, because for me, it would be safe supply. And by that, I mean that we start with supervised consumption spaces where people who are getting their drugs from wherever can go. They can have their drugs tested by someone. They're establishing trusted relationships with people who are showing up in a way that's all about caring them, not shaming them or punishing them. They are being monitored. So in case the testing of the supply turns out, maybe it was accurate, but it turns out that person's tolerance wasn't ready for it, there's somebody that's immediately there that can save their life. So start with safe supply in all the ways that can look, and really focus. I think it's super simple. If our North Star is let's keep people alive no matter what, jails are not the answer for that. Providing safe supplies and building trust with caregivers is the answer for that.
Yeah. James, I'm going to throw it to you next.
I think we should proper re-education and safe drug use, like an adult drug use. Like, they say drink responsibly for drinking. If we're going to go forward with decriminalization of drugs, we should really teach people
how to be safe.
And how to be safe. Exactly. Like safe consumption sites is a definite plus. I know like Deaunte said, in Canada, I know I've seen some videos online about using sites, and they've worked wonders to what we have here, which is nothing right now.
And I think that's a great point too about helping people know like what the signs of overdose are, helping them know how to use Narcan. Drink responsibly, use drugs responsibly. Representative Macri.
Yeah, I think those are both really, really important. And I spent my career on providing safe housing for people with no preconditions, and making sure that everyone has access to a safe place to live. And so I think that is essential. And when I talk about housing, I talk a lot about harm reduction housing. So all of these strategies need to be infused into a place to live. And one of the things that has gotten me so upset about this bill is that as state policymakers, we're just making our jobs harder, because we've sort of increased the barriers for people to get into housing by now saying, we think people should be saddled with criminal charges, criminal convictions, which we know makes it more difficult to get the kind of stability folks need. So one of the things I have been focused on as we go into the next legislative session is like, how do we reduce those collateral consequences that the legislature has just created that make it more difficult for people to get jobs and housing? That's a place I really think we need to focus on.
Yeah, and then before I throw it back to Deaunte, I should mention we've got a few minutes set aside here for audience questions. We don't have any yet because I think I didn't tell you how to do it, but if you put it in the chat, our lovely support staff will relay it to me and we'll ask the panelists. In the meantime, Deaunte, your magic wand?
If I had a magic wand, if I had a magic wand, I'd be able to bring my friends back, and I can't. Now, if I could change something, I think it would just be to re-educate our politicians and our leaders that are out here in community. And that's just I think just at the end of the day, I still think that we have an opportunity to invest in safe supply, but having conversations like this. So if I'm going to use my last couple of minutes, I do want to make sure that we are promoting real change, because this is exactly what it is, a real change for community members. Yes, you may be unfamiliar with safe supply. Yes, you may be unfamiliar with Narcan. Yes, you may be unfamiliar with community members that may use injection drugs, but people are dying. People are in survival mode, and they don't need to be behind bars or your new levy. They need access, equitable access to care, and real politicians that care about their real needs, instead of just a check off the box. A check off the box does not mean, incarceration does not mean that you're doing the job. That's scaling us all the way back.
Yeah, I really liked your point earlier about politicians getting out and walking around among people who are using.
Get your ass outside, because that's really where the work is. They've sat behind their Zooms, and now at the end of the day, it's not an offense. Please contact Vocal. I would love to take you to some of the spaces where we be at. But we're speaking to community members with lived experience constantly, and would love to speak to community politicians. There's been people that have been running for the 3rd district. Shout out to the 3rd district that have came out there to the Civic Hotel and has seen what's going on, because they know that it's impacting their area. And they didn't want to talk to the community people that were running the facility. They wanted to talk to the people.
Yeah.
So come to the people. Don't dance around and have a conversation around them. That's just only causing more harm and more destruction.
Yeah. Well, I still haven't gotten any questions from the chat. I suppose we should have announced this earlier. So maybe we'll just do a couple little bonus questions if we have time. Let's see, what did we not cover? I guess the thing I would really like to know, especially when we have an elected representative with us, is what is the political climate like for decriminalization, for some more harm reduction, for some more housing?
I think this legislative session, and I think the community conversation that City of Seattle is having right now, is a bit of a wake-up call that it's sort of one step forward, 2 steps back. And I even observed that I actually thought that my colleagues were further along in their understanding of substance use disorder as a health condition, and their understanding of the principles of harm reduction. And that's in part because in the legislature and in state policy and local policy, things like use of Narcan to reverse overdose has become much more accepted. Things like use of medication to treat opioid use disorder, whereas previously this idea that you had to go through it and get clean and not be dependent on medication was the norm. We really saw, including very conservative politicians, accept the idea of citing methadone clinics, of increasing access to Suboxone and Sublocade, medications that help people who are living with substance use disorders. And I mistakenly thought, people fundamentally understand the principles of harm reduction. but they don't. They really, I learned this session, they don't understand the principles of harm reduction and what it means to really reduce harm. Because harm reduction is not about just using Narcan or using Suboxone. Harm reduction is about engagement, is about creating that social connection with folks to help people feel like they can and should make healthier choices, and giving them the tools to know how to do that. Deaunte's been sitting in his car with most of the time with his seatbelt on, right? We all understand that seatbelts are a form of harm reduction that reduces our harm when we wear a seatbelt. It's very well accepted, but the concepts of harm reduction as they apply to substance use, I think we still have a lot of education to do. So in terms of the political climate, what I've learned is, okay, we've got to do a lot more education than we thought we needed to. And I think what Deaunte is suggesting of like, we need for politicians and policymakers to be in conversation and engaging with people who've been impacted by drugs, either people who themselves are drug users, family members who have close insight into the experiences of people who've been harmed by drug use. I think all of that needs to increase significantly. And I can say, I've done a lot of LGBTQIA civil rights work over the years, and I am really struck, and this may come across as controversial, but to me, this feels very similar to kind of our fight for marriage equality, in that, like, for me, it's very clear. To me, my votes in the legislature were about thinking about myself in 20 years and wanting to be on the right side of history, and knowing that my votes this year are the ones that in 20 years, people are going to look back and say, oh yeah, those were the votes on the right side of history. And to think about always our kind of fight for progress and justice, and how long it can take, and how people often kind of revert to this place of othering and this place of fear. And that's what we're hearing now, in my experience, is we're uncomfortable with seeing people experiencing misery. We don't like the social disruption that is happening in our society now. And so we're acting from a place of like, can we just get it out of sight? And if we just criminalize, will that just get it out of sight? But I remain hopeful. I wouldn't continue to do this work if I didn't remain hopeful that we're just like, we're continue on the journey. And I feel like doubling down on engagement and education with policymakers is going to be important. And as I said, I'm really taking it as a helpful lesson of like, okay, now I fully understand where we are and the work. And it's given me some bit of clarity about what the work ahead will look like. We're further from decriminalization than I thought we were not long ago, but I'm really grateful to the Supreme Court for the 2021 Blake decision, or else I don't think we would have gained this insight, or that our state would have pushed forward on a lot of the progress that we have seen.
Yeah, so we're at time, but I want to be fair to the audience members. If any of you can stick around for a couple minutes, I have a few questions in chat. One of them super quick, and I think either Alison or Representative Macri can answer it quickly. From everyone's favorite drug dealer, Ian Eisenberg: did something change this year regarding testing strips? Are they now legal?
Yes.
Drug testing strips are classified as drug paraphernalia. And so there was actually a couple separate bills on that, but the policy to essentially decriminalize paraphernalia was included in the final Blake bill. So that does include that for fentanyl strip or drug testing strips generally.
Yeah, what I would add to that is, earlier when I was talking about being able to test, is that fentanyl strips are not the best and certainly not the most comprehensive testing that we have available. And there are forms of testing like mass spectrometry, where the quantity of drug that's being tested, some of that's going to be returned to the person. And from a criminal legal perspective, what we want to make sure is that care providers who are providing testing services to people with whom they're trying to build trusted relationships for engagement and connection to the first steps of recovery, is that they're not worried about either being charged for delivery of drugs to someone because they're returning part of a sample that they just tested for them, delivery still being a felony, of course, or that any of the programs that are providing this service for individuals are facing any civil liability consequences. There are some protection from civil liability that was included in 5536, but not for everybody. And the idea that you could be sued for wrongful death because you didn't keep all of the drugs that someone handed to you to test is a real risk.
Yeah. That kind of touches on OD and maybe we call it after this one, but Andrew asked, should we have a separate department to respond to OD instead of the police?
Fire
Your thoughts
department,
yeah.
they're more medically trained. Fire department, fire department does show up for that, but also the police. But,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah,
Thank-
I mean, I think we should ensure that people can respond to overdose, make it ubiquitously known, right? So I think Narcan should be broadly available. People should feel like it's very simple, relatively simple to use. So similar to the steps that we know in terms of CPR, or how to call 911 when someone's in distress, making that available. There are many outreach teams that are regularly responding to overdose. EMS, so Medic One, Seattle Fire here in the city of Seattle they're constantly responding to overdose. I think one project that I've been working on, mainly in my day job at DESC, but certainly intersects with this issue, is so then what's next, right? So when people have non-fatal overdose, when we're able to reverse an overdose, we have a unique opportunity to engage and support people in that moment in a way that can help bring comfort and disrupt the trauma that overdose brings in, and sort of the trauma of drug use. So what does that look like? So I think the things we heard about in terms of safe consumption and safe supply are important, but there are areas in East Coast cities where they've really been working on sort of post-overdose stabilization. And how does that provide, how can we use that moment to provide support to people who have just experienced, one of the most serious kind of behavioral health crises that you can experience. And so I actually think we're in a moment now where Seattle can really innovate. So in the context of the state policy, there are still lots of opportunities for Seattle to respond to the overdose crisis that our community is experiencing now with very humane and effective approaches. And I have been talking with our local policymakers to encourage them to really lean into these opportunities.
Yeah, well, I hope that some of them watched or were listening, and we'll take all of your wonderful advice. I want to thank everybody for coming and watching us, especially our panelists for sharing their incredible wealth of knowledge. And I just hope we can continue this conversation and maybe change some of the negative and harmful narratives around drug use in our state and our city. So thank you, everyone. Keep doing the good work out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, and I'll just make one more plug as is required. Again, we are in the middle of our spring fund drive and we are a little bit short. So realchangenews.org. Thanks again, everyone.